It's good to see all of you here this morning. It's a great pleasure to be here among you, and an honor that I get to speak to you. I was talking about speaking this morning with a couple of folks. I mentioned to David, I said, I worked on this, but I'm still not sure it's going to be any good. And he said, we'll let you know. And I thought, well, no pressure in that. And then I was talking to my granddaughter, and she asked me, she said, are you speaking today? And I said, yes, I am. And she went, and I thought, oh, my goodness. And she said, no, I just don't get to sit with you. Okay, I skated on that one. We'll do the best we can this morning. I don't know. You may have to let me know. And when this is over, you may be going as well. A while back, we met and talked about our teaching program, what things we thought we needed to cover, what the congregation would benefit most from, and things like that. And one of the things that was brought up, and Matt spoke on it the last time he talked, was about encouraging people toward spiritual maturity. And Matt talked about some things that pertain to that. I'm going to continue those thoughts today. I guess I'm a victim of my own speaking up, because I was the one that sort of pushed this issue a little bit. So I guess it's only right that I should have to cover this. And so I'll do the best that I can today. Matt, I'm going to follow what you said, and I hope not duplicate a bunch of it. But we're going to talk about some things today that will hopefully help us with that subject. Matt started his lesson about spiritual maturity with a picture that looks something like this. This is not the same one, but something that looked like this. And he talked about how that in life, we progress through life in stages, the way that shows, and that our spiritual maturity doesn't always correspond with our age, because a person sometimes that's 30 can be more spiritually mature than someone who's 60. Certainly that's true. That can happen. We see that happen. And there are good reasons for that. One of those reasons is we don't always enter the Christian walk at the same point in our life. And so you couldn't expect everybody to progress at exactly the same rate as you do in your physical development. We don't have any choice about this. This is a given. It's going to be linear. We're going to go from young to old, and there really isn't anything we can do about that. But spiritual maturity is not like that. There are some things that we can do to help our spiritual maturity, to make it more linear. Regretfully, sometimes our spiritual development looks more like this than it does that linear development that I just showed you a moment ago. It looks more like a roller coaster. We're up and we're down and we're in and we're out and we're going in circles. And it's because, in part, we don't stop to think about what we need to be doing in order to develop ourselves spiritually. We need to understand what that is and what it's not. And in order to avoid this in our spiritual life, we have to be intentional about growing spiritually. Not let it be accidental, but let it rather be intentional. We're going to talk about this morning what I've entitled the foundation of spiritual maturity. I want to talk about some things over maybe the next few times that I speak that are foundational to it. There's a lot of things that go into it, but there's certain things that underpin it all, like the foundation of a building. And part of what we're going to talk about through the next few times is that exactly, including this morning. So we start with a question today. What does it take to make our way through this journey of life that we're all on so that we have the spiritual growth that we desire to have for ourselves and for other people? Because we're going to see today that we all affect each other. We're not in this alone. How do we go about living this life so that we progress on a steady trajectory like we've talked about? Now, there's lots of New Testament teaching about that, There's an abundance of it. In fact, most things in the New Testament have something to do with spiritual maturity. That's why it's there. But there's really not a chapter you can turn to and say, okay, do these things and you'll be spiritually mature. We don't have a place that we can just go look for something along that order. But there are some things that we can go to where that issue is embedded. In fact, that's most of the way spiritual maturity is addressed. It's embedded in other subjects. And that's what we're going to talk about this morning. 1 Corinthians chapters 8 through 10 contain a lot of teaching about spiritual maturity. It's broken into 3 chapters, but if we actually could look at the original text of it, it wouldn't look like that at all. It would all be together. Those 3 chapters are really dealing with essentially a subject, something that has been asked and answered. And so the modern Bibles that we have break down this teaching into chapters and verses for convenience of study and reference. But that's not how this was originally laid out. 1 Corinthians chapters 8 through 10 would all go together. And they provide a lot of information that's valuable to us. And so we want to talk about some of that this morning. Now, these chapters are easy to misunderstand if we don't consider them as a whole. I have heard people over the years pick and choose verses or portions of verses from these chapters and really miss the point of what those teachings were actually saying, because they took it out of the context in which it was given, out of the reason why the scripture was there to begin with. So we want to go through these this morning so that we don't have that error in our lives, so that we understand exactly what these teachings are about. Now, a cursory reading of these, and if I asked you, gave you something you could write on this morning and said, tell me what these chapters are about, a lot of you, maybe many of you would say, well, they're about eating meat offered to idols. That would probably be a common answer that you might give. Perhaps that's what you would think. That is part of what's taught there, but that's not the main point at all. These 3 chapters have a point, and that's not it. That's used to teach a point. It was the question that was raised, and that question was answered, truthfully enough. But there's a bigger picture here, and we want to try to figure out what that is. It's easy to get lost in talking about eating meat offered to idols and completely skip over the big picture that Paul was trying to present. So today we're going to go through 1 Corinthians chapter 8. I wanted to go through chapters 8, 9, and 10, but I didn't think any of you would pack a lunch today. And that's what it would take to go through those 3 chapters. And so we'll restrict our comments mostly to chapter 8 this morning, and that'll be plenty for what we want to do today. So let's start by looking at the principle that's at issue, the reason for the problem. What was Paul addressing? That can be found in the first part of the first verse of that chapter. And here's how it reads in the King James. Now, as touching things offered unto idols, we know that we all have knowledge. That's the way the King James reads. It's a little bit hard to understand exactly what it is that Paul's saying from that rendering of the scripture. It's hard to know exactly what that means. What does it mean when he says we know? Who's we? What's he talking about when he says that? And a lot of the scriptures are that way in the King James because the original manuscripts didn't really have the punctuation that we're used to seeing today. So sometimes things that are quotes don't look like quotes to us necessarily in the King James. It's harder to pick out those. This is an example of that, I believe. Here's how the ESV renders it. Now, concerning food offered to idols, we know that, quote, all of us possess knowledge. So we see from that part of that scripture or that writing of Paul's is he's quoting something that was said. That all of us possess knowledge. That's not what Paul's saying. He's quoting what was said to him. And I believe that's an accurate take on what this particular verse is saying. And it helps if you look at it that way. It helps to understand the meaning of it. So what had happened was, and Corinth is an example of many problems, as you know. An issue had arisen on behalf of some of the Corinthians who believed that they had this so-called knowledge about eating meats offered to idols, and they believed that this knowledge that they possessed justified their behavior and what they did. And we're going to say in just a few minutes what they did. The scriptures will tell us that, exactly what they were doing. But they believed that their knowledge justified their behavior. Others didn't think that. And so apparently a letter was written to Paul raising this issue along with many others that the church at Corinth had. And so that's what Paul's addressing. So the first thing that he does is he responds to their purported knowledge, this claim that they have some kind of knowledge that they're relying on that justifies what they're doing. So here's his first response from the second part of the first verse. And I'm going to give you, again, I'm going to give you the King James and I'm going to give you the ESV because I think it'll help you understand better if I do both. So in the King James it reads like this: knowledge puffeth up, but charity edifieth. Here's what the ESV says. This, quote, knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. That quotation around knowledge helps us to understand that he's talking about this knowledge they have purported to have, this knowledge that they claim justifies their behavior. It makes it a little bit easier to follow what it is that Paul's saying and what's been said to him. This word knowledge, if you go look at the origin of it, what was it translated from? It basically means to know with certainty, to be sure that you're right about what you think. And I think that's the position that some in Corinth were taking. We know with certainty the right answer to this issue. So here's what Paul is basically saying back to them. What you believe is knowledge has really only created pride and arrogance. That's what that scripture is telling us. He said that knowledge has puffed up, has caused you to feel proud, caused you to be arrogant. And he said that's what this knowledge has done for you. That's what it's done. He's telling them that since your knowledge isn't accompanied by love for your fellow Christians, it tears them down instead of building them up. That's what Paul is telling them in response to their question about this knowledge that they supposedly have. Now, what can we glean from that? We're going to stop in several places through this today, and we're going to talk about what can we learn about spiritual maturity from what Paul is saying. And so I don't want to go all the way to the end before I do that. So at various points through this, we're going to stop and say, what can we learn from that? What can we gather from what Paul said? Well, one of the things that we can learn that helps us with growing in spiritual maturity is that knowledge itself can certainly cause pride and arrogance, because it did do that. And Paul said it had done that. So we're not left to guess about whether that's possible. Paul made it clear that was part of the problem. It had caused pride and arrogance on behalf of some of the people at Corinth. So we know that knowledge can do that. We can gather from that knowledge is not the only factor when we're dealing with other people. We can know as much as we want to know about whatever the subject might be. And apparently that's what some at Corinth thought that's the kind of knowledge they thought they had. They knew with certainty they were right. You can have as much knowledge as you want to know when you deal with other people. And that's not the only factor that matters. There are other factors involved in our dealing with other people besides how much knowledge we might have. I think we can learn that knowledge is a component of spiritual maturity, but knowledge absent love for other people does not produce spiritual maturity. And that you may think, well, that sounds like a strange statement, because a lot of times when we think about spiritual maturity, our thought is, well, what it takes to be more mature is just to know more. I need to know more. Sometimes that's how we define spiritual maturity. And when we look at other people, sometimes that's how we think about it. We think, well, so-and-so is spiritually mature. They know more than I do. And that's really not the measure of it, is it? If that were the case, these people in Corinth that were claiming to have this knowledge would have been an example of maturity, and they weren't, because Paul is certainly telling them that and is going to continue to do so. Apparently, this was a problem that Corinth was dealing with quite a bit. Back in the very early chapters of 1 Corinthians, Paul talks about how there's divisions and so forth among them, and apparently that was caused by things like the attitude we're reading about here. So apparently that was a problem that existed in that church. And he said in 1 Corinthians 13:2, and I've paraphrased this is not an exact quote, but I believe it captures the meaning. If we knew everything about everything, but didn't have love, what good would it do? That's essentially what he said. If you knew everything there was to know about everything, and you didn't love other people, and you didn't love God the way you should, what would that profit you? Of course, the answer is nothing. It wouldn't profit anything. And so knowledge is not the whole answer to maturity. It's only one component of it. This is a statement that I have on the screen now that many of you have heard before. People don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. Have you heard that? A lot of you, I know you have. This statement has been attributed to Theodore Roosevelt. If you read where did this come from, a lot of people say, well, Theodore Roosevelt said that. But from what I can tell, there's no real proof he ever did really say that. It's been attributed to him, but we don't know if that's where it came from. But there's truth in that statement, isn't there? There's certainly truth in that statement. People don't care what you know until they know if you care or not. If you don't love people, it doesn't matter how much knowledge you have. It doesn't matter. It won't do any good. Because people sense that. They pick up on it, and they'll know. And so we can learn from this. We can learn something about spiritual maturity. Spiritual maturity involves not just knowing, having knowledge, but knowing how to use the knowledge. Learning how to deal with other people with the knowledge we have, and not be arrogant and overbearing the way these people apparently were. Okay, the second response that he gave them, and I probably should mention that in the first 3 verses here, Paul kind of starts out just defining what caused the problem. It's sort of a parenthetical type of statement that he made in these first 3 verses. He starts kind of laying out, well, here's why there's a problem. And you're going to see in verse 4, he's going to go back then again and talk more about the problem. So we're still in basically the parenthetical statements that he made. So here's his second response in verse 2. If anyone imagines that he knows something, he does not yet know as he ought to know. I don't know about you, but if I were the Corinthians, I'd hate to hear all this. This would be tough to hear, wouldn't it? I think it probably was tough for them to hear. It was not what they wanted to hear from Paul when they wrote and asked him about this issue, I suspect. So he's made some pretty pointed statements to them, not unlike Paul is prone to do in a lot of his writings. He can be, bordering on sarcastic about some of his remarks sometimes. And maybe that's a little bit of what it is here. He basically said, you say we know all this. We know. We know what we're talking about here. And we know because we have this knowledge that what we're doing is okay. There's not a problem with what we're doing. We know that. And he says, you think you have a full understanding. You think you've got it all figured out when you really don't have that. He said, you think you know something, and because you think you know, you really don't know at all. Talk about something tough to hear. Those kinds of statements had to sting when he told them, you think you're really wise on this, and you're not. Because you think you know, you don't know. Because you think you're mature and you've got this all down, no, you don't. You don't have it. What can we get from that? What can we learn that helps our own development into spiritual maturity? We can learn to be aware of how much we do not know. That's kind of important. It's hard to learn until we start to realize what we don't know. If we're like them and we think, well, we got it all figured out. We know everything. We know everything about everything. No, you don't. That's what he said. No, you don't. So we can learn from that. I remember, and sometimes I'm still guilty of this, but I was worse when I was young, if you can imagine that. I thought I had things figured out. I thought I had it. Just ask me, I'll tell you. You want to know how it ought to be done? I know. Ask me. I don't feel that way today. Sometimes I feel like there's a whole lot more I don't know than what I do know. And I hope that's a sign of more maturity. I hope that's what that means. It's either that or I'm really getting dumber as I get older. Maybe that's what it is, but I hope that's not it. I do believe that part of learning and becoming mature is understanding what we don't know. Unlike the Corinthians who thought they had it all figured out. We've got this down. We know. He said, no, you don't. You don't know. Because you think you know, you don't know. So we can learn from that. Be aware of what we do not know. Be aware that sometimes the most dangerous time of our life or the most dangerous position that we can be in, spiritually speaking, is when we think we've got everything figured out. That's the most dangerous position to be in. That was the problem they had here. They thought they had it all figured out. Response number 3, and we're still working through his parenthetical statements. He said, but if anyone loves God, he is known by God. What was he saying to them? He was saying, it's not your knowledge that makes you approved of God. That's not what does it. And he's not condemning knowledge. Don't go away from here saying that I said he was condemning knowledge. He's not doing that. But he's telling them that is not your first priority. That's not the foundation of your spiritual maturity. Your knowledge is not going to get the job done if that's all you have. And apparently that's the way it was. God's approval, he I think is telling them, is on those whose actions are prompted by knowledge, informed by love. That's what works. That's when you've got it figured out, is when you can do that. They hadn't done that. And we'll see a little bit further on that they had not really shown love to other people. What can we learn? Well, spiritual maturity is when we seek to be approved of God because we love Him and because we love other people, not because of how much we know. Because if we're waiting to be approved of God based on what we know, we won't ever get there because we'll never know it all. We'll never know enough. Whatever we know will never be enough. It will never be enough. So we can learn from what their experience was to try to seek God's favor because we love God. And because of that, we love His people. Unlike the Corinthians, who apparently didn't do that. Now, let's look at some of the conclusions that the Corinthians drew because they said, we have this knowledge. We've got this figured out. So here's the conclusions they drew. We know this thing here's our conclusion about it. And that is going to be pretty much the rest of the chapter this morning. So we'll start in verse 4 of the chapter, the first conclusion they drew. I'm going to, again, read the King James as well as the ESV because I think it will help with understanding the Scripture. The King James reads like this: "As concerning, therefore, the eating of those things that are offered in sacrifice unto idols, we know that an idol is nothing in the world, and that there is none other God but one." That's the way the King James reads. Here's the ESV. "Therefore, as to the eating of food offered to idols, we know that an idol has no real existence and that there is no God but one." Those things that are in quotations there are like the ones I mentioned before. The original manuscripts don't have that kind of punctuation, but I think you can see from the context that he's quoting what they told him. He's saying that they have said that they know that an idol has no real substance. There's nothing to it. It's just an idol. It's not real. And that there's no God but one. There's just one God. All these idols that the pagans have created, they're not real. We know that. And that's what they're saying. And he's saying, that's what you've said to me. You see those things that are in quotations, I believe that's what those are. Here's his response to that. He said, for although there may be so-called gods in heaven or on earth, and he's talking about these false gods that we've mentioned, as indeed there are many, quote, gods and many, quote, lords, and yet for us there is only one God. And when he talks about for us there's only one God, he's talking about us Christians. We know, the ones who belong to God, we know there's only one. We're aware of that. There's only one God, the Father from whom all things are, and from whom we exist, and one Lord Jesus Christ, through whom are all things, and through whom we exist. Pardon me for that poor reading. So this is his answer to them. Yes, I hear what you're saying about there only being one God and so forth. And so this is what he says. Essentially, he's saying, I agree with you. What you said is right. I can't argue with that. There is only one God. All these other gods are not real. They don't really exist at all. I agree with what you said. Now, I want you to notice there's a couple of times, and this is the first of them, when he basically says, I agree with you, and then the very next thing he says is, however, or you better watch out. So he kind of qualifies his statement about, I agree with what you said. This is one of them here. He says, I agree with you. There are many so-called gods that have no real existence. That's true. I agree with what you said about that. Your knowledge is right. I agree that there's only one God and only one Lord Jesus Christ. You're right about that. No argument from me on that. But here's his second response. Notice the first word. However, not all possess this knowledge. I don't know what they meant when they, early in the reading, where he said, we all have this knowledge, whether they were saying that all of them knew the same thing. If that's what they were saying, Paul refutes that here. He says, not all possess this knowledge that you have. Not everybody has it. But some, through former association with idols, eat food as really offered to an idol, and their conscience, being weak, is defiled. Not everybody sees it like you do. This meat that was offered to an idol, to some people, that doesn't seem like it does to you. Some less mature Christians don't have full knowledge about this. They don't have full knowledge about these pagan gods. They don't know. They don't have your understanding. They're less spiritually mature than you are. And he said, because these Christians were formerly associated with idols, these are things they had been around before, they think that eating food offered to an idol is like worshiping those things as a god. That's how they view it. So your knowledge about this is not universal, and it's not agreed by other people necessarily. Remember I said earlier that because we think we have knowledge, it doesn't resolve everything? And it didn't here. And he went on to say then, their conscience is being weakened when others eat this meat that's been offered to idols. That's what you're causing. And all of this, he's trying to get them to see, this is what you're causing. This is the problem with what you're doing. He could have just said, you shouldn't eat meat offered to idols, stop it. Could have said that. Ultimately, that is what he's going to say. And we jump ahead to chapter 10. He says there basically, what you're engaged in is idolatry and you shouldn't be doing it. But he's trying here in this chapter to get them to understand what they're doing to other people and what problem this is causing. And so he makes these statements to them to help them understand it. What can we understand from it? What can we draw from that? We don't have food offered to idols to be concerned with. When we get our meat, we typically go to the grocery store to get it. We don't have to worry about that. And if that had been the only issue here, this would have been a really short discussion, because it would have been easy to say, don't do that. And in fact, time would have taken care of it anyway. In about 2 centuries after this was written, meat offered to idols wasn't much of an issue anymore. So there's obviously more to learn here. So Paul says in the next reading, food will not commend us to God. We are no worse off if we do not eat, and no better off if we do eat. I'm sorry, I said that was what Paul's saying. This is their second conclusion from what they had understood from their knowledge. So this is another statement of theirs. Food will not commend us to God, and we're no worse off if we do not eat, and no better off if we do. This is their second contention, their second conclusion based on this knowledge that they supposedly have. There's a little bit of a disagreement about what this statement means. About half the people that you read about will say that Paul is stating what the Corinthians said to him, that this statement on the screen is their statement, not his. And the other half of the people said, no, that's what Paul said. That's Paul's statement. I don't know which it is for sure. I am inclined to think this statement is from the Corinthians. This is what they're saying. It's just food. This meat that is offered to idols, there's nothing significant. It's just food. And you're no better off if you eat it or if you don't. It doesn't make any difference. God doesn't care where you get your food. Seems like that's what they were saying. So we don't know if he's quoting them or if it's his statement. Like I said, I lean toward thinking he's quoting them. But under either circumstance, Paul seems to agree that where people get their food doesn't really matter to God. One is not brought closer to God or moved further from God by what he eats or where he gets it. That seems to be what he's agreeing with. That is something that Paul thinks is right. But listen to his response. And here's that second time he's done this. Notice how he starts. Last time it was however. This time he says, but take care. So you're right in what you're saying. You're right, but you're wrong. And then here's what he says. But take care that this right of yours does not somehow become a stumbling block to the weak. For if anyone sees you who have knowledge eating in an idol's temple, will he not be encouraged if his conscience is weak to eat food offered to idols? And so by your knowledge, this weak person is destroyed, the brother for whom Christ died. Thus, sinning against your brother and wounding their conscience when it is weak, you sin against Christ. Quite a statement that he made. Here's what he's telling them. Your knowledge of your liberty to eat meat offered to idols could easily become a stumbling block to other people who are not as mature as you, who don't have your knowledge, it would be easy for that to happen. A stumbling block, that term is not one that we would use, but it's not hard to understand what it means. It's basically anything that would cause somebody else to trip up, just like it sounds. Put something in their way that causes them to trip. In other words, it presents an occasion for them to sin. So that's what he's saying. What you're doing could easily be a stumbling block to other people that are less mature spiritually than you are. He's telling them that if someone without your spiritual maturity sees you, that's important, sees you in an idol, in a temple of an idol, eating meat offered to idols, they might be tempted to do the very same thing. They might think it's okay. I mean, in their mind, they're thinking, we've been taught you couldn't do this. And I see Dale doing it. Must be okay. I guess I can do it. So he's trying to point out to them again, here's the problem that you're creating with your so-called knowledge. This is the first time in our reading today where we can really see what it was they were doing with this knowledge that they had. They weren't just eating meat offered to idols. They were doing it inside the idol's temple. So it was more serious than just simply eating the meat. They took it a step further. They went right into the idol's temple to eat it. You think that might be a problem for some people? I don't think there's much question that it was a problem there. Obviously, Paul's addressing that. If you can look back in historical writings and see what these idols' temples were like. And they were very common in that part of the world in that time. The people who worshiped those false gods would bring offerings to their priests, just very similar to what the Jews did. And their priest would take a portion of that and give the rest back. And that meat that was given back could be taken by the person who offered it. It could be sold, or sometimes it was just simply placed on a table in the middle of the temple, and people could come in and buy the meat and eat it there. It'd be like going to, Golden Corral. And so this is the setting in which he's talking about these people were going in and eating. They were going into these temples and eating this meat that was there, that had been offered by the pagans to idols. So Paul tells them, your exercise of this supposed right you have to eat meat that's been offered to an idol, because you understand that it's just food, is actually destroying your brother. And beyond that, it's causing you to sin too. That's what he's telling them. They never had seen it that way at all. They thought they were doing exactly right. Remember, we started out and they said, we understand. We completely get what this is, and we're not doing anything wrong. What can we draw from this? Well, we can learn from this that we need to recognize when our own conduct, even if it might be all right within itself, is of a nature that a less mature, spiritually speaking, person might misunderstand that. And that's what they were doing. The less mature didn't understand why they were going in these temple and eating there. They didn't understand that. So we can learn that we can do that too. And we're not going to go into an idol's temple, but there's a lot of other things that we could do that'd be in this same category. I'm not going to list all those. You use your own imagination about that. There's a lot of things that people could do today that other people would look at, and it might be a stumbling block to them. And we need to learn, if we're going to be spiritually mature, we've got to learn what those things are. Recognize when we're engaged in that. We need to recognize when something we're doing just kind of seems pretty innocuous, but actually to other people it looks sinful. And that's what they were doing. They were, again, it's just meat. What difference does it make where we get our food? It did make a difference. It mattered because it mattered to other people. And we can learn to avoid behaviors that when someone else who is maybe less spiritually mature sees it, it might cause them to sin. And that's what was happening here. Specifically what Paul said. We can learn that for ourselves. And when we're spiritually mature, we will learn that. Avoid behaviors that might cause other people to be involved in sin. That's an important level of maturity that we need to reach. Now that's kind of maybe a little bit of a nebulous concept, so let me use an example here to try to bring this home a little better. You'll remember the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the book of Daniel. And you'll remember that the issues that came up with them when Nebuchadnezzar ordered that everybody in the country, when the music played, everybody would bow down to this idol of himself. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego wouldn't do it. Said, no, we're not going to do that. They did it at the peril of their life. At least that's what they would have thought, because the penalty was death for not doing that. So they said, no, we're not going to do it. Now, couldn't Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego have just done it? Couldn't they have just bowed down to the idol and said, well, I've got knowledge. I know that idol's nothing. I know that statue's just a hunk of metal out there. Doesn't mean a thing. I'll just bow down before it, avoid all the hassle, save my life perhaps. Could they do that? Well, they didn't do that. It's not what they did. They said, no, we won't bow down to that. Why was that? Why did it matter? If they knew in their mind it didn't amount to anything, why couldn't they just bow down before it? Because other people saw it. Other people would see what they were doing. Other people would understand that they thought that there was something to this. That's what other people would think if they bowed down. So they said, no, we won't do it. Let me bring that home a little closer to our time. What if we're ordered to confess whether we believe in Jesus Christ, and if we do, we're going to be imprisoned or put to death? What if you or I face that today? If our government said that, and we know that that's what we say to them doesn't matter, it's not an issue. If we know in our mind that it's not, could we just go along and say, okay, we're not Christians, we don't believe it? Could we do that? No, it wouldn't be acceptable, would it? Wouldn't be acceptable. For the same reason it wouldn't have been for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Other people would see that. Other people would see it. We're not on this ship alone. We got to think about what other people see and what they think and what it's going to cause them to do. So if we behaved in that way, we could easily become a stumbling block, just exactly like what the Corinthians were. The next response from Paul, and we're coming to the end, and he's sort of wrapping up the whole concept here. Therefore, and I think that kind of tells you where he's coming from. Because of all the things I've said, therefore, if food makes my brother stumble, I will never eat meat lest I make my brother stumble. That's not hard to understand, is it? Not hard to understand. His point is this: no matter how clearly you may think you understand this spiritual issue, in his case it was the meat offered to idols, you should never use knowledge like that in a way that damages the faith of other people. Should not do that. And that's what they were doing. That's exactly what was happening. And he said, I'd never eat meat again if that's what it was going to cause. I'd never do that. I would never do anything that would cause my fellow Christian to stumble. What can we learn from that? We can learn that in order to be mature, sometimes we're going to have to give up things that we think that we could rightfully do, that we could rightfully participate in because of our knowledge of it. But we'll give those up because it's damaging to our brothers and sisters. Isn't that the message? Isn't that the lesson from this? In fact, when we get to 1 Corinthians chapter 9 on some other occasion, we're going to see that most of chapter 9 is exactly that teaching. Paul talks more and more and more about himself, about the privileges that he had, about the fact that he was an apostle and what that permitted him to do, and how he would give those things up. He would willingly not do those things, even though he was entitled to do them. So, can we learn that lesson? I think certainly that we can. Okay, now the conclusion. Are you shocked I've gotten through this fast? For those of you who haven't thought about it, this is 2 in a row for me, by the way. So give me some credit. And David, when this is over, at least say that. At least say, it wasn't very good, but at least it was short. So here's the I guess if you use the business term, I attend business meetings sometimes or seminars or whatever, and they always say, okay, here's the takeaway. Here's what you can take home with you. So let me see if I can put out the takeaway today. Loving God, and because of that, loving other Christians, is a fundamental, foundational principle in being spiritually mature. That's where it all starts. It has to start there. If it doesn't start there, we can't achieve real spiritual maturity. A spiritually mature Christian will use the knowledge that they have. And again, let me say, Paul was not condemning knowledge. And neither am I. We ought to get all the knowledge that we can obtain in our life. We should do that. But he was criticizing the way that they used it, the way the knowledge was applied, and the fact that they didn't care for the other people and how it made them feel. Did not care about that. They were 100% right about a lot of the things they said, and they were 100% wrong in what they did. So we can learn that. That's a take-home for us. A spiritually mature Christian will display in their life what they believe in their heart. They'll display in their life what they believe in their heart. And I want to refer you back to what we talked about with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They knew that this idol that they were required to bow down in front of was nothing. They understood that. But they could not do something that conflicted with what they believed. They couldn't give the appearance that they were doing something that in their heart they knew they could not do. And a mature Christian would be the same way. I hope these thoughts are helpful to you. As I told David, I worked hard on the lesson, and up to it, I asked my wife, up to and including this morning, I was saying, I don't think this is any good. I don't think this is very helpful at all. I hope it has been. I hope it's better than what I feel like it has been. We don't close without offering an opportunity for anyone in the audience this morning to obey the Lord in baptism, if that's a need that you have. We also offer an option, an opportunity for anyone who needs the prayers of the congregation, and sometimes that's very helpful to people. And so we offer that opportunity at every service. If there's someone in either of those categories, won't you come forward while we stand and sing?